Hi everyone, it's Ross Anderson here from Brave New World Wines in Sydney, Australia. And we have series number 2 in the series of Meet the Maker, where we hope to or aim to inform you, entertain you and educate you on the wines that you love from around the world and the colourful personalities that make these wines and bring them to your living room. Now, as many of you may be aware, and we hope you are aware, COVID-19 has had a massive impact on the South African wine industry in particular, which is enduring one of the toughest lockdowns in the world, where all forms of direct sales, retail sales, cellar door sales, or anything to do with the sale of wine to the consumer in South Africa is completely banned. However, exports are still permitted. And so we are rallying around there's a hashtag going around on the internet. It's hashtag Drink South African, and we are rallying around this in all of our communications at the moment to encourage everyone, not necessarily in Australia, but anywhere in the world that has a love or a fascination for South African wines to get involved, drink South African wine and support this industry the best way we can, even though we're not in the country. Now, on to today's show, and this is quite a special show for me. The person that we're going to be chatting to in just a sec is one of the nicest personalities I've ever met in the wine industry. I have very fond memories of my first encounter with this estate. It was a good 5 or 6 years ago when I was in South Africa on business. And the only time that we could make to meet up and discuss the wines and the potential to bringing them into Australia was on a Sunday. And of all the days of the year, it was Mother's Day. However, they were very insistent on proceeding with this meeting, and so after many hesitant thoughts about invading on a Mother's Day Sunday, I decided to take up the kind invitation. And it was probably one of the best decisions I've ever made in terms of building a relationship which we really value and being exposed to some phenomenal wines being made here. I was made to feel very welcome. There was no airs and graces. The house was opened up, the tables were out, the food was on, the wines were pouring. I think we even opened, or the person that I'm about to introduce opened a bottle with a saber of one of his first batches of a wine that we may discuss shortly, and it's all history from there on in. I think it ended about 10 o'clock that night in the barrel room, and a bottle of whiskey came out of nowhere. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but I think that's probably where the secret stash is housed these days. Anyway, the estate that I'm referring to is Vondeling Wines from the Voor-Paardeberg ward, which is just on the backside of Paarl. And we're joined live from Paarl with senior winemaker Matthew Copeland. And we bring him in here. Hey, Matthew, how are you?
Hi there, everyone. Lovely to be here.
Matthew, welcome to Meet the Maker, episode number 2. And before we start, happy birthday.
Thanks very much. Yep, it is my birthday. And
21 again.
If only.
21 yeah. on repeat. Matthew, tell us how are things back at home? Let's get at the nitty gritty. I mean, we're reading a lot in the press and we're reading a lot, and I guess we take bits with a grain of salt, but you know, you're there, you're on the ground. What's happening? What is the sentiment? What's the state of play at home at the moment?
Well, Ross, thanks very much for that intro and the support you gave there. And yeah, I remember it was Mother's Day. The full family was out. It was a complete baptism of fire. So good on you for keeping up the friendship afterwards. Yeah, it was one of the last big sessions before the onslaught of fatherhood, and that's added a grey hair or two. I remember we even managed to, well, you might have forgotten this, but I managed to explode a glass lid on a pot of pasta, and we had to redo and reset. So almost a physical impossibility. Right. Yeah. So the situation at hand. Yeah, I think it's worse than for most wine producing countries. We've had a erratic stop-start to sales of wine and even exports of wine. It's been devastating for the wine industry and even for every service that the wine industry is involved in, be it hospitality, bottle production, all that sort of thing. And I would say the repercussions, we don't quite realize them yet. So any support is great, but we don't sit in our laurels. We fight on, and we remain optimistic. So exports are going well. It's European summer at the moment, so lots of wines going to Europe. we're lucky. There's some of my friends that supply almost exclusively to South Africa, but we're about half local, half export. So that does cushion the blow somewhat.
Let's move on to Vondeling. I love these wines, as you well know. Tell us a little bit about the history of the estate. I mean, you've been there since 2008, is that correct?
Yeah, in 2008 was my first vintage. I actually joined almost exactly 13 years ago, in June of 2007. So one can really say that I did start in 2008 when I was involved in that year's grape production and of course crush. Vondeling itself began around well, not as a farm. The Swedish immigrant was given this farm in 1704 already, so it makes it a very early farm. And obviously the reason why you would have been granted a bit of land in those days is because it was a good piece of land. It had available water, it had space, it had all that sort of things. So historically one of the earliest in the Paarl area, but for good reasons. My immediate boss, who is a British fellow from Hampshire, he started here in the late 90s, and then he got a couple of friends to muck in around 2000 and began renovating the farm. The infrastructure was rather poor. The vineyards were in poor state, and the cellar had been shut since about the 70s. So that took several years, and the cellar reopened its doors in 2005. And I'm very lucky to have been here for such a long period of time, and to be able to put my own stamp on this great farm and be involved in such a good team. I think we go from strength to strength every year.
Absolutely. I mean, the British fellow that we're referring to is, of course, Julian Johnson,
right.
who has bought some of your delicious. I think it was the first vintage of Bowood Pinotage. He bought over in a suitcase, and we had lunch in Sydney, and he showed me this wine. He was extremely proud of the wine, and quite rightly so. I mean, I guess we'll touch on that in a minute, but we've shown that wine at Pinot Noir festivals of all the places, not Pinotage festivals in Australia, and it's been an absolute rocking success. And I think Australians see that wine like a Barossa Shiraz. But anyway, we'll talk about that in a minute. You left school. You travelled extensively through the wine regions of the world. You came to Australia in that trip. Where did you go? You went to the Barossa?
Yeah, I went to the Barossa, and I worked for a fellow called Lou Miranda, and I worked on their Barossa production. At that stage, I think they were the third biggest wine company in Australia. So we're going back to, I think it was 98. And as I understand, a lot's changed for the Miranda family since then. But yeah, lovely. Loved my time in Oz. Traveled a bit up to the Gold Coast, and who knows? Maybe I'll end up there with things the way they are over here. Maybe I'll end up there if you'll have me.
Absolutely, you're always welcome here. It's quite funny while we're touching on that. One of the key members of our staffing that make this operation tick is a lady by the name of Joanne Corbett, who's ex-Creation. And Joanne joined us about 6 months ago, and she's only been in Australia for about a year. So it's great having those personalities from home working with us in Australia. So absolutely, you're more than welcome. You can come and run part of the ship. I'm sure we can find something for you to do.
Pack some boxes and whatnot. I'm good at that.
Pack some boxes. Tell me, Matthew, the farm as it stands in its location, why is it so well suited, this piece of land, why is it so well suited to these delicious style wines that you make? And you make a gamut of styles from entry level right through to ultra premium or super premium. What's unique about the Vondeling farm and the location?
I think it's worth mentioning that a portion of our farm, in fact, runs through, or the Swartland boundary, Paarl Swartland boundary runs through the upper portion of our farm. So in fact, one of our wines, which comes from a single vineyard on the upper slopes, could in fact be classified as Swartland if we really wanted to be pedantic about it. But I only bring that into to sort of illustrate how vast Paarl as a region is. and it sort of flows from one mountain to the next across the valley. So what you've got is you've got west facing slopes, which of course will get very hot in the afternoon because they'll face the afternoon sun. And then you've got east facing slopes, which will, get early activation in the early hours of the morning and it'll be more temperate. So that's the Paarl Valley in a nutshell. But then of course us being against the Potter Berg, we're slightly unique in that almost all our vineyards are situated on a spur that runs off the Potter Berg mountain. So our area, the Voor, meaning front side of the Potter Berg, faces east. So it catches the morning sun, which is an advantage, and then the setting sun recedes behind the mountain when it's hot. And I mention all these things because for those people that don't know, Paarl is pretty warm, and Swartland and Malmesbury, our neighbors, those are pretty warm as well. So if you've got something that can temper that, it plays a key role. So this spur then faces south, which is of course key because it faces away from the equator and doesn't get quite so baked during the day. All right, and what I think a lot of people don't realize in vineyard terms is that the difference of the sort of 2, 3, maybe 5 at most degrees that would have on the sort of bunch zone vineyard areas occurs at a very essential tipping point, and that tipping point, let's use round numbers, let's say is around 35 degrees Celsius. So if you can be below 35 degrees Celsius, your vine functions as it should. So photosynthesis, respiration, all that sort of thing go along quite smoothly. So yeah, nice long sunny days, you're building up sugars, but all the other things that the plant's supposed to be doing, like ripening your tannin, developing your flavors and your pigments and all that sort of stuff, that's progressing as it should. Once you go over 35 degrees, the vine goes into a defensive mode and it closes its little breathing pores, it shuts down photosynthesis, all that sort of stuff. And those are not good, because then your ripening essentially comes to a standstill. All your organoleptic ripening and phenolic ripening, that sort of thing, comes to a standstill. And the plant still needs to somehow function. So it needs energy to do that. Energy it would be normally getting from the sun and converting during photosynthesis. So it uses up its reserves, which are fundamentally in the forms of acids, which immediately means that you're getting a lower acid grape and grape juice and wine coming to your cellar, which means you're getting an elevated pH. And the moment you have an elevated pH, everything goes pear-shaped. Bacterial spoilage, color instability, oxidation, everything. So that is, say again, Ross?
Big knock-on effect all the way through.
All the way through. So while we're by no means cool, we exist largely in the happy zone for the plant, and that's quite key. Then the other key thing, apart from the aspects and the location of the sun and all that sort of stuff, is the soils. They are mostly free draining granite soils, so they're quite poor, and ironically, that's good for wine because your production is low, and you're getting lots of flavors. And the soils are very, very, very old, so they're very, very deep. And so the roots can go deep, and the roots can maintain their water levels throughout. On the lower slopes, we've got some ferrocrete, which is sort of gravel light, and some clay, which is really good for things like Merlot and that sort of stuff. So essentially, if I can narrow it down, we're very dynamic and on the happy side of the hot world.
Fantastic. Now, Vondeling itself has more than wine going on. There's a strong nature conservation aspect to the estate. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the Cape Fynbos, and I mean the wine itself, the Babiana, has a reference to a certain sort of plant that's unique or grown in that area or only found in that area. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the Potter Berg, and for those the people watching that have an interest in this sort of thing, is what you would call a small mountain. It's a granite outcrop, and it's entirely surrounded by farmland. So it is essentially like an island. And there are plant species that exist on this mountain that exist nowhere else in the entire world. And one of them, of course, is the Babiana. The Babiana is specifically Noctiflora, after which we've named our white, which really brings home where the wine is made, the unique conditions under which it's grown and made. And that's what we try and do. We try and make the best combination of flavors and in a celebration of where we're from. To get back to your primary question about conservation, yes, most of us feel very strongly about conservation, and that the mountain is very special, and that we, of course, are custodians of the land. So if you are a custodian of the land and you strip all the romance away from it, looking after the land is good for your farming, is good for your future. So that's just a really intelligent way to look at it. But we've taken it a step further, and Julian's wife drives a bunch of initiatives on the conservation side, be it fire prevention, which we had, of course, increased government support many years ago, but a lot of the sort of government duties have almost been privatized, and you have to self-manage. And one of them was, to a great degree, was fire prevention. So to protect the mountain, we initiated this for the region as a whole. Then, of course, there was a fire in 2011, which was the first fire in a few decades, and a bit of a wake-up call, I suppose, for many people who may have become complacent. And following that, the natural fynbos in the Cape does need fire from time to time to regenerate. It shifts the pH in the soil because of the ash content, the heat germinates certain seeds. So there's this huge rebirth of flora that occurs after a fire. And we felt it was so special because it hadn't happened in so long, that we had sort of dominant big forests of protea and things which didn't allow sunlight down to the soil areas. And we expected to see a lot of bulbs and various other seeds germinate. And reached into our pockets and employed some botanists to do research for well over a year. And they, in fact, discovered new species of plants. They discovered plants that were thought to be extinct. And it was just an absolute magical time. That first spring was a kaleidoscope of colors we'd never seen and possibly never will see again. And we documented this all in a book called From Fire to Flower. And yeah, that was really exciting. Other initiatives within the winery, I did a quick calculation yesterday. I hadn't done it since I initiated it. I think I must have initiated it probably about 8 or 9 years ago. And that was a conscious decision to move to lighter bottles. In that first year, we saved 30 tons of glass. And now annually, we would save well over 120 tons of glass. Which is a significant difference that you can make by taking a relative. Give us a bit of grief about that, but we don't pay it too much mind, because you can't really sit on the fence. You have to make some sort of commitment. So that's one of the commitments in the cellar. Various other things, wastewater. We use recycled cardboard in most of our packaging. Yeah, and then possibly, because we are planting some orchards now, a nice extensive beekeeping project, because bees are under threat.
Absolutely. So while we're on the whole packaging discussion, your thoughts on small bottles, instead of a 750 ml, 375, or maybe even a 200 ml bottle. What's your thoughts? What's the market talking about in South Africa? Obviously, when you're able to buy wine in South Africa, do you think there's a new space for these smaller bottle packs, these smaller formats? And they're not new, but on this side of the world, we're starting to see a little bit more activity in terms of how they promote wines, how retailers are getting behind that. What's your thoughts on smaller packaging, smaller formats?
You're going slightly off script there, Ross. I don't know.
There's no script, bud. There's no script.
I know that's a tricky one.
Maybe it's a speeding fine or something. I don't know what that paper was.
No, I'm happy to jump into this one. Just obviously you still got some sort of closure in that per bottle. Your glass to wine ratio is a bit higher. There's a limit to how thin you can make glass. So as you started off asking that question from a sort of environmental point of view, I don't know that that's the best thing. I know there are some projects, and in fact we are loosely involved in creating a cardboard bottle, sort of like a very fancy milk carton, I should think, which of course is going to be much lighter and fully recyclable. One of the problems in South Africa specifically is that we rely heavily on coal for generating electricity. So the glass furnaces are run on coal, so it's quite dirty glass. So onto the perhaps other half of your question, Ross, is how do I think about it as a trend, and maybe with regards to sort of, how much should you indulge in alcohol or not? And then I think in that regard, it's great. I think smaller bottles, maybe not the very small ones as we call them, dinkies, but something slightly bigger, something like a 375 or a 500 mils. I think that could be quite useful. We're seeing more of that in Europe at the moment. The other thing, of course, that if you are a serious wine drinker, I would urge people to buy something like a Caravan, which you can, of course, the correct word, there we go, that looks like it's out of Star Wars or something.
They are getting that way now. For those playing at home, this is a Caravan unit.
What generation is that? That looks like a Gen 3 or something.
Look, it's about a year old, but your Babiana is opened with the Caravan screw cap, and because I don't want to drink this. I'd love to drink this bad boy all by myself, but I want to keep it as well for a bit longer. So
yeah, so I think that is probably the most sensible way to go, because another thing that I'm becoming slightly aware of, and thanks for the intro you did online with the young gun and all that. As I getting older, I'm finding myself slightly more sensitive to large quantities. So I'm going in the direction of quality, and of course something like the Caravan's the best way to go. You can open up a real stoker of a bottle of wine and get back to it in a couple of weeks' time. So you can really match your wine to your food, and there's no cost disadvantage or no pressure to have the wine. So that's where I'm personally going. But I do think, in answer to your initial question, I think smaller bottles are becoming increasingly popular.
So getting on to the wines now, you've got a range of wines at various price points. What do you think? What variety excels at Vondeling? What really does well there?
Well,
not just the variety. I mean, I know you love Merlot. This is for Vanna, if you're playing at home, Vanna. I know you love Merlot, so.
No, yeah, I do love Merlot, possibly because I love the challenge of it, and possibly also because I just want to piss some people off. But because you're not supposed to like Merlot if you're out here. Anyhow, we're still trying to figure it out after a couple of decades at it here in the farm, but something like Chenin Blanc, and increasingly we've been doing a lot of pinotage on the farm, but not putting it into our own bottle until sort of 6 years ago, and it's showing very well. It's aging very well, and of course pinotage is uniquely South African. So if you take Merlot, for example, you've got a heck of a lot of competition out in the world. If you take pinotage, you've got a heck of a lot of competition within South Africa. So that's the idea behind the Bowood pinotage, and the soon to be released Bowood Chenin that we delivered to the docks for you today, Ross. Yeah, Wonderful. Yeah, the idea behind that is that we create not only an excellent wine, but a wine that, should you be a serious collector of wines and a lover of South African wines, that you can only get from South Africa. So that's the idea behind the Bowood. To get back to the farm, the reason why we have got so many different grapes and do make so many different wines is, I think, A, because it's a hell of a lot of fun, and B, because the farm can do it with our slope leading off the mountain onto the sort of lower lying areas, different soils, that sort of thing. But certainly as time goes by, I think we might streamline the portfolio a little bit. And it is ironic that I do believe one of our strengths, and you have to do it from the ground up, is Merlot. But of course, the no-brainer for the area is Shiraz and its various counterparts of Mourvedre, Carignan, Grenache, Viognier, that sort of thing. So we do focus on the upper echelon. We have the Shiraz-based Monsonia, which is really coming into its own now after making it for 13 years. It's crazy, but that's sort of what it takes for a farm to figure out how and where things should be done, which clones work well. Vineyards only really show themselves after they're 10 years old. And although we've got vineyards going back to sort of 1981, we have got a lot of vines that were planted between 2000 and 2005. So if you look at Vondeling over the last over the last decade specifically, I think you'll have found a very positive quality trajectory.
Oh, absolutely. Now, I know that you like to experiment with bits and pieces in the farm and bits and pieces in the winery itself, in the dark corners where nobody can find it. It's a bit like Harry Potter. Have you done any sort of witchcraft or magic in this wine in particular? When I think of Vondeling, I think of one wine. I mean, I love all your wines, but this, I keep showing you this bottle. Keep everyone look at this bottle. This is the Babiana. Babiana, 64% Chenin, 19% Viognier, 8.5 Roussanne, and 8.5 Grenache Blanc. This is one of my all-time favorite wines, and I'm not just saying that because you're on screen. I bang on about this wine until people tell me to shut up. There must be some sort of magic in here. Tell us a little bit about Babiana.
Okay, so that's the 2017 you have there, and I think if you hold your glass up again, the first thing about that wine will be obvious. It is not pale. It's not a commercial wine, although it does fairly well commercially. It's not made in a sort of a sterile fashion at all. That particular vintage you have there is the highest percentage of Chenin that we've ever had to date. And it was just that it was an outstanding Chenin Blanc year. That was the first year of severe drought. And the Chenin Blanc vineyard that we use as the anchor for that blend is one of our 1980s, late 80s vineyards. So it's very deep rooted. It can handle stress. And so obviously it had a very small production. And yeah, so I just whammed as much as I could in there as possible. I think it was also the first year that we excluded Chardonnay. That might have been 2016. I can't remember all the blends, but yeah, the 17 doesn't have Chardonnay, neither does the 18, neither does the 19. To get back to the color, so the components, as you said, Chenin Blanc paste. Now, half of the Chenin is fermented on the skins very briefly, so that gives you a lot of structure and also gives you a bit more color. And then the other half of the Chenin Blanc is chilled as juice to try and get as much of the solids out of it as possible. And then it has a much cleaner ferment. So you've got a dirty ferment and a clean ferment. That gives me options later on when it comes to blending. Then the Viognier, the Grenache, and the Roussanne, for multiple reasons, the Viognier, by the time it gets ripe, it starts to get a little bit wrinkly and a little bit syrupy inside. Even without very high sugar levels, it does this. This sort of flesh begins to collapse and become quite viscous. So when you're pressing it as we would, as a whole bunch, your juice extraction is quite poor. So that has economic ramifications. But if the quality was outstanding, then we would accept those ramifications. But the second negative is the one that we find unacceptable, and that is all your flavor components, or the vast majority of flavor components, are situated just below the skin of the berry. So if you can imagine the berry is a little bit slimy, and you're squeezing it as a whole bunch where you can't press the skins that hard, that slimy layer underneath the skin is not getting extracted. So you're not getting the vast majority of your aromas. Now, that's why we will destem it, not crush it, and then we will partially ferment it on the skins at a relatively low temperature. So just like you're putting a tea bag in cold water, we keep the fermentation temperature very low, so we don't get too much structure or coarseness from the skin itself. But we just allow the yeast time to break down that slimy layer inside the berry, and of course, as it ferments, so it actually inflates the berry like a balloon, which makes it very, very easy to press. And I'll send you pics or a little video at some point of what that juice looks like when it drains off those fermenting skins. It's paper white. It's glow in the dark white. It's a very special, unique wine color. The same goes for the Grenache Blanc, but for different reasons. Grenache Blanc is quite light in structure. So other people would say it's quite lean. It has good acidity though, and it has good aromatics. So if you ferment it on the skin and you win a tiny bit of structure, you get a better balance. Roussanne, it seems to be there's about 3 or 4 or 5 pips in every berry. So if you're pressing it, you're also not getting a lot of juice and a lot of aromatics. That is very different to the Grenache and Viognier. By the time you press that, it looks like muddy dam water. It looks absolutely vile. There's something in one of the pigments must oxidize very, very easily. But of course, it oxidizes away into a solid form, and during the ferment, it falls out. And Roussanne, interestingly enough, after your ferment, it has a very green color. So it goes from this muddy sewage-like looking substance to something that's beautifully green. Yeah, so those are the various practices, and then of course it takes you a couple of months to put that all together. You start with big brush strokes, let's say 50% Chenin and 15% Viognier and soupçons of the rest, and you allow that to sort of marry and settle, and then you fill in with another barrel of this, another barrel of that, and until you get it the way you want it, and that can take about 3 months.
Well, it's magic because you seem to get it right every time, and I've tasted multiple vintages of this wine, and it's still my absolute fave. But getting on to some other bits and pieces, the excitement when I spoke to you, was it 2-3 weeks ago? You were hyping up as if you'd been eating those red jellies or whatever. Bowood, tell us a bit about the Bowood project. You've got the Bowood Pinotage, which I referred to earlier on. And there's the bad boy there, which won the 16 won the Michelangelo. Is that the?
That's the 15. So that was a Michelangelo trophy, whatnot, 4.5-star platter, and then the 16, which I felt was a better vintage. Crikey, I'm trying to figure this thing out. There we go. That's the 16, and we've just released the 17. Yeah, so the idea behind the Bowood is when we have parcels of vineyards on the farm that are really outstanding and haven't yet had a designated home. This is a very, very bold vineyard. It's got quite a lot of clay in it, and clay tends to texturally be exactly like you would imagine clay. When you feel it, it's sort of quite big and substantial. So it lends itself to being a kind of a new world style, which is sort of big and bold and juicy. And Vondeling is as, and I hate saying brand because we're just a farm. Everything comes off the farm, and we make wine only from our own grapes. So to say a brand seems to somehow dilute that whole feeling. But as a brand, the Vondeling is quite Eurocentric. So we've got Rhone influences, we've got Bordeaux influences, Loire influences, all that sort of stuff. And we lean to something that's possibly more elegant and more classical. And yet this was a vineyard that absolutely didn't want to do that. It wanted to be loud and proud. So we took up the Bowood mantle, which is a sort of more bold packaging. It's the one wine that does come in quite a heavy bottle. It's black, so it's got black cap, black label, and yeah, it's sort of quite striking. And that allowed it to express itself rather than try and fit into some Eurocentric box. This was South African, this was New World, this was big, this is exactly what the vineyard wanted to give it to itself. So Bowood was brought back to life as a single vineyard Pinotage. Similarly, we've located or come to have sufficient faith in a single vineyard of Chenin Blanc. So we've paired up. We've now introduced a second wine into the Bowood range. Also, as a sort of a tap the hat to South Africa, it's a Chenin Blanc, if I may. Go the wrong way. There we go. Right, and this is not yet released. And of course, it's a mirror image of the Pinotage. So the label is double white. The capsule is double white. And I think 19 has been a fantastic year for us to put that into bottle. And of course, we've waited until we've had really good Chenin vintage again to put that into bottle. So that's something to look forward to. That'll be in about November.
Yeah, well, yeah, as I mentioned right at the start, we've taken that along to Pinot Noir festivals, and yeah, we got away with a bit of cheekiness there because we said it's a Pinotage and this is a Pinot Noir, and they were cool with that, and so well received by the Australian audience.
If I remember correctly, you took a few bottles of our Pinotage Method Ancestral. This is
Chardonnay. So it was
this is the Chardonnay
and the Pinotage. Yeah. Yeah, that's magic as well.
Yeah.
Is that tell us a little bit about that wine, the Method Ancestral and the Method Rural? That's the names, yeah?
So the wine itself is called Rural, which is quite cheeky. But Method Ancestral is a term for making wine in a single ferment, which completes its ferment in the bottle. So you'd begin fermenting in a tank or a barrel, and just before the sugar supply is depleted, you bottle it, much like you would a champagne, and the fermentation finishes in the bottle. Now, if you are making champagne, it's quite a lot easier and simpler because you pick the grapes, you make the wine, you put the cooling on, you go on holiday, and you come back, you throw some sugar in it, and you stick it in a bottle and finishes ferment. You go back on holiday, and then you riddle, degorge, and you sell it for a vast profit. Now, Method Ancestral is slightly trickier because, of course, you do pick it and you do ferment it, and then you have to bottle it in a very small window. So unlike when you are adding sugar and yeast back to the bottle and have a very, very tiny population of yeast and sugar. So that's not a very vigorous ferment. In fact, by the time you stick it in the bottle, the ferment's hardly begun. You can bottle relatively leisurely. You can bottle all day long without any major stress. But with Method Ancestral, you've got a very powerful fermentation. You have a full biomass of yeast that are all competing and charging for the finish line, trying to eat the last of the sugar. And so when you start bottling, you've got a very small window of opportunity because your sugar depletes very quickly with this big yeast population. So you can only do a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand bottles in a few hours before the pressure in your bottle difference from when you start bottling to when you finish bottling is going to be remarkable. You're going to pick up a difference in quality. So that's one of the challenges. The other challenge is, of course, that this all takes place right in the middle of harvest, when what you should be doing is picking grapes and focusing on ferments, not on bottling. So the first few years of this, and we were very lucky to be the first recognized producer of method ancestral in South Africa. When we began, it didn't even exist as a category in South Africa. So we were the first farm to be rubber stamped. So that's quite exciting. I think to this day we're still probably the biggest producers of method ancestral. There are a few other people that produce what is also known as the Pétillon Natural, the Pet Nat.
Yeah.
Which is a lovely thing to do, but it's a more simplistic approach, and it's drunk a lot earlier. This was a light bulb moment for me when I heard about method ancestral. What it allows you to do, because it's a single fermentation, is to pick riper. And we'd always wanted to make a sparkling wine, but when you're in a hot area, by the time you get to the sort of sugar levels where you should be picking for a 2-stage ferment, it's really, there's not a lot going on in the grape. So, we don't want to make something that isn't good. So we didn't do it. Whereas if you've got a single fermentation, you can pick with a potential alcohol of 12 instead of 10. And you've got something that's a lot more complex, a lot more full-bodied, and a lot more exciting. So yeah, that's where the light bulb went on. I didn't have any idea how I was going to do it, so it was a sort of a shotgun approach. It worked out really well. 2014 was the first year, and we've managed to figure out a few tricks as we go along to sort of streamline the process and get the quantity and quality up there, consistent year on year. So it's been really fun. Hopefully it'll go from strength to strength, but we're not doing it to be a gimmicky wine or something, that's not drunk on its merits. It was a conscious decision to try and produce a superior quality of sparkling wine from a warm area.
Well, you've hit it on the head. Tell us, is there anything else in the pipeline on the horizon that you could share with us? Anything else that's a secret project, or maybe not a secret project, but plans for the future?
Well, I think we've sort of grown up now, definitely in the last 5 years, where we've got a proper sort of wine club, and we've got people that buy our wines consistently, so we can to a degree have a little bit of fun again, go back to our roots, and of those experiments that often go into big blends to make the blend more interesting. The Babiana, if you taste the Viognier that's fermented on the skins, or the Chenin Blanc that's fermented on the skins, it's a really interesting wine. And so what we want to do with those various experiments, or those slightly less commercial blending components that we make, is actually bottle small amounts of them and share them with our wine club, with our friends, really. So if that was something that was interesting to you, for example, then we could, send 10 cases out. It's not something that we want to do pallets of. It's something we want to talk about and have some fun with in wine. So we've got skin fermented Sauvignon Blanc that we want to do. We've got, Mourvèdre that was whole berry fermented, stuff like that. That's more interesting than amazing.
Tell us about your favorite wine memory.
Wow.
Not mine. It was having lunch with you guys on Mother's Day. That was one of my favorite all-time wine memories.
That was a good one. I think my favorite wine memory, I probably got two, and from totally different sort of parts of my brain. I mentioned what that wine looks like when it drains off the Viognier skins. There's color in wine and in light. Color, light, the way light moves through wine. If you look at that Babiana, it's not light in color, but it's very vibrant. I think that's something unique to wine. And I remember the first moment that I noticed that very consciously. I was working in Switzerland in 1997, and we'd gotten to the bottom of the tank, and it was late afternoon, and there was was sort of a typical movie moment, but there was a high sort of skylight and there was angular light coming through the cellar. And we got to the bottom of the tank and we opened the door to drain that last little bit that never quite goes through the valve. And it was this sort of beautiful, soft cascade of wine running out I mean, there wasn't a ripple on it at all. And the way the light caught that, the light danced through the wine. And yeah, I don't know, that was just a very conscious, very conscious moment. And another moment was sitting in a little side cafe in a fairly wealthy part of London, being treated to dinner, and this was several years ago, and I got sort of carte blanche of picking a wine off the wine list, and I said, "Oh, well, this one looks quite good," and the person who I was with, their girlfriend, said, "Oh, I don't know, is that one all right?" And so my friend sort of smiled and said, "Yeah, why not go for it?" And it was a first growth in a wealthy area of London, so I can only imagine the price. There weren't prices on the menus, that sort of place. But yeah, and then having this wine and just thinking it was so absolutely mind-blowing, delicious, and also having no idea what it was. Then taking the bottle home with me as a souvenir because I just loved it so much, and then reading up about it and realizing what an idiot I was, really. So there followed a very strongly worded letter of thanks to my friend, who was very polite about it.
I believe you're a bit of a reggae fan.
I'm definitely a reggae fan, not so much when I'm driving, but very much during harvest in the cellar. It gets a little long, and reggae keeps you calm.
So what's on the playlist in the car at the moment that involves a guitar at least? And hopefully an amplifier.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I was digging in my CD collection last week, and so what's in the collection at the moment is some Placebo and some Linkin Park.
Oh, okay. Well, not
quite reggae at the moment.
So, just getting back to the state of play in South Africa, what do you think the new normal will be? Everyone's throwing this word around. What's the new normal? What do you think is going to happen? What do you think the new normal will be in, say, 6 to 12 months after we've probably got over this hump, maybe even longer in South Africa? How do you think things are going to unravel? Is it going to be like return to some of the traditional models, or are we going to really see what you touched on there, the wine club, that direct-to-consumer? What's your thoughts on that?
There's two parts to your question there. There's trying to guess what the South African government's going to do, and then there's trying to guess what the world is going to do with wine. I think what the world is going to do with wine is probably far easier to guess. And yeah, I would definitely say there's a threat to wine as we know it, not necessarily a bad thing. We are not involved in the mass promotion of wine. Just, there is an intellectual and quality aspect to the wine that we make that I don't think is ever going to go out of fashion. It appeals to the human spirit, and that's certainly our approach. That is why we are grown, made, and bottled. We love every aspect of it. So I think that will remain, but you will have to be nimble, and you will have to be able to, as we are now, be able to engage directly, to be able to bring that message across, that human nature of what you're doing. So yeah, I think there's going to be more pressure on the price at the lower end. So the vast majority of South African farmers are probably going to collapse under that, because we are not a volume producing nation. And then the premiumization at the top end is going to accelerate. And then, just with communication, definitely closer and closer.
Yeah, closer to the consumer, closer to the producer. Yeah.
Yep.
So tell us, in conclusion, what can we as wine lovers, consumers around the world do to do our part? I mean, we obviously can't do a hell of a lot, but what we can do and where we can access it, what can we do for Brand South Africa, for South African wines in general?
Well, I would hope that rather than get a kind of a sympathy vote out of this, where people go and buy wine to sort of feel better about what's going on in the world, I think rather than that, and I mean, by all means, go out and buy South African wines. We've got a lot of wine to get out of the tanks and whatnot. That will definitely be a big help. But I'm really hoping that what people will take away from this is the realization again of the farmers behind these wines. The farmers don't have they can't pass the buck. The vines are in the ground. The next harvest is coming, and I hope people will realize that there's a population of very dedicated viticulturists and farmers in South Africa, and that there's a lot of great quality to be had. So hopefully it'll start with this kind of idea of let's help either fellow South Africans or just people generally in need of a bit of help, and it'll be a joyful discovery, and it'll go from there. So I would much rather what comes out of this is to be a kind of an intellectual sharing experience than what it is people going to the local supermarket to try and move volume out of South Africa.
The voyage of discovery is hopefully where people will end up and realize the value for money and the secrets, the hidden treasures that is South African wine. Matt, we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you so much for your participation, especially on your birthday. Happy birthday. Hope there's a dinner, a lunch, a birthday cake, something going on behind the scenes there. Please pass on our best wishes to everyone back at Vondeling, and it's been great talking with you. Cheers and thanks for joining us. And thanks everyone for patching in, and for more information about any of the wines discussed, check out our website, bravenewworld.wine. Till next time, cheers everyone.
Ciao.